My partner and I used to love taking weekend camping trips pretty often. We lived right within the Blue Ridge region of North Carolina, so naturally, we would explore new places on or near the Blue Ridge Mountains. Our workdays were usually very hectic, so getting away and being surrounded by nature on the weekends really helped us unwind. When this happened, we had already been on numerous camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains, but none of them had ended like this one. It was a Saturday morning, and we picked a short, 3-mile trail that led to a secluded camping area on a flat spot on the mountain. We hadn't tried this spot before, but it had plenty of reviews online, so we figured it must be fairly well known. We packed our bags and loaded up the car with our camping gear, and then we set off. It was only about a 40-minute drive from where we lived, but as we got closer, it started raining heavily. This wasn't unusual for this region, so we didn't let it bother us or change our plans. When we arrived at the trailhead, which was just off the road, we saw only one other car parked nearby. We had expected more people given the popularity of the trail, but we were actually glad it was quiet. As we were unloading our gear, my partner noticed that the other car's passenger door was slightly open. We both looked around but saw no sign of the owner. Thinking they may have accidentally left it open, I went over and pushed it closed. The seat was already soaked from the rain, but I thought it'd be better to keep the water out. I headed back to our car to grab my things, and then we set off down the trail. We chatted about how odd it was that the door was left open and how most people would realize their car wouldn't lock because of it. The car looked newer and expensive, which just made it more curious. Anyway, the rain was picking up, so we quickened our pace to reach the campsite and set up our tent. It took us nearly 2 hours to reach the end, as the trail was mostly uphill. Once we arrived, we noticed a small tent already pitched in the center of the flat area. It looked like it was only big enough for one person. We assumed someone was inside, staying dry from the rain, so we went to a corner of the site and set up our own tent there. We settled in for about an hour, eating the snacks we had packed and drying off some of our gear, when we heard voices outside. The rain was loud against the tent, so I unzipped the front to take a look. I was startled to see 2 men crouched close by, staring at us. But then they smiled and introduced themselves. They mentioned they'd been staying in the center tent for a few days. I quickly introduced myself and my partner, explaining we were just staying for one night. After they left, I zipped up our tent and exchanged a glance with my partner. The interaction felt odd, and their behavior was strange. Both men were wearing tight jeans and plain shirts, and their tent seemed far too small for 2 adults. It just didn't look like they had been there camping or hiking, especially for several days. We left the tent zipper slightly open to keep an eye on them, just in case. Another hour passed without any unusual activity. By the time night fell, we decided to go to bed. I zipped up the tent, and we got into our sleeping bags. I must have fallen asleep quickly because I don't remember anything until I woke up a few hours later, needing to use the bathroom. I put on a cheap rain poncho and stepped out behind the tent, staying close to some trees. As I was out there, I started to hear voices through the rain, but I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. I looked around in every direction, feeling uneasy, but I didn't see anyone. Then, I noticed that the small tent's zipper was open, and I was pretty sure it had been closed earlier. It looked empty now, which made me even more anxious since the men had said they were staying the night. I rushed back to our tent and shook my partner awake, explaining what I had noticed. She was groggy but also started to feel uneasy. As we discussed what to do, we both heard voices again, coming from somewhere behind our tent. I decided we couldn't just sit there, so I told her to start packing up quickly. I grabbed a small pocket knife and stepped outside, looking towards the trees. There, only a few feet from our tent, were the 2 men, just standing and staring at us without any expression. They didn't move or react, but I knew at that moment they had bad intentions and weren't the least bit afraid. Seeing them shocked me, but when my partner peeked out of the tent, it snapped me back into action. I told her to start running down the trail, and I followed right after her, leaving our things behind. As we reached the edge of the campsite, I looked back, and the men were still just standing there, watching us. They didn't pursue us or anything, they just stood there. We ran for about 10 minutes before we slowed down, walking quickly the rest of the way. When we got back to the car, the other vehicle was still there, with the passenger door open again. We drove to the nearest gas station and called the police, who arrived soon to hear what had happened. A few days later, we learned more about the situation, and it was horrifying. The police found out that the car belonged to an elderly man who had recently been reported missing. His belongings had been taken, and the tent at the campsite was his. They didn't find any trace of the two men, and no solid evidence other than some shoe prints. The old man hasn't been found to this day. This experience left us shaken, realizing how close we had been to something terrible. We'll probably never know for sure what those men were planning, but I can still picture them standing there, emotionless, and it haunts me. When I was in my late 20s and early 30s, I was fortunate to have a job that involved a lot of traveling. Most of the time, I would only stay in one place for a couple of days because of work, which meant I didn't get much of a chance to explore. However, during a week-long job in New Jersey, I ended up finishing early, leaving me with an extra day before my flight. Since I rarely had free time, I decided to make the most of it and try something fun. I chose a long trail that passed through some beautiful forested areas. I've always loved nature, but with my job keeping me inside offices or on planes, this was a great opportunity to enjoy some fresh air and scenery. I woke up early but had to stop by a store to grab hiking clothes, as I hadn't packed any. The trail was about an hour away from my hotel, and I arrived a little before noon. It seemed like I was the only one there, which made me pretty happy. From what I read online, the trail would take about 6 hours round trip, so I knew this would take most of the day. I packed a small backpack with water and snacks and started walking. The first hour was peaceful, just me and the path surrounded by trees. It was a great way to relax and escape the stress of work. As I walked, I noticed a man sitting on the ground ahead, leaning against a tree with a hood covering his face. He looked like he might be sleeping. As I got closer, he lifted his head and gave me a long stare as I passed him. Not sure what to think, I continued down the trail, checking behind me a few times, feeling a bit uneasy. A couple of hours later, I was getting tired and decided to rest on a small log along the path for a snack. After just a few minutes, I saw the same man from earlier walking down the trail toward me. He was still a little ways off, so I quickly gathered my things and kept moving, hoping to avoid any interaction. But a few minutes later, I heard the sound of fast footsteps coming up behind me. I turned to see the man jogging towards me. I stepped aside, thinking he would pass, but he stopped right in front of me. I felt nervous and uneasy. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a wallet and said, "I think you dropped this." It wasn't mine and I could tell it was empty. I told him he must be mistaken, as I hadn't brought my wallet with me. He insisted it was mine and told me I needed to take it. Not knowing what else to do, I reluctantly took the wallet from his hand. He looked me straight in the eyes, gave a smile and said, "You're welcome," before walking away down the trail. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The wallet was an old, worn-out, brown one. I opened it, and as expected, there was nothing inside. Feeling a bit unsettled, I decided it was time to head back. By now, it was around 4 p.m., and I still had over 2 hours to hike back to my car. I tried to enjoy the walk, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept glancing around to make sure he wasn't following me. Finally, I could see my car up ahead, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows. My car was parked facing the trail, so I approached from the front. But just then, I noticed a shadow crouching behind the car. I froze, realizing that someone was hiding behind it. I didn't want to run, as I figured he might come after me. I carefully reached into my pocket for my keys and then started walking to the passenger side. Quickly unlocking the car, I got in through the passenger door. Immediately, I heard the man jump up and rush to the driver's side. I managed to lock it just as he tried to open the door. He banged on the window, yelling at me to give back the wallet. Ignoring him, I climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, and reversed out onto the main road as fast as I could. He retreated into the trees as I drove away. I remembered passing a police station earlier, so I stopped there to report what had happened and handed them the wallet. Later that evening, I called a friend to share the story, still trying to make sense of it. It was clear he wanted to rob me or maybe even steal my car, but I still wonder why he used the wallet as a way to approach me. I'm just grateful I got away safely. Since then, I always carry a small pocket knife when I go for walks, just in case. Last year, towards the end of October, I went hiking during one of those perfect fall weekends when the weather wasn't too hot or too cold. I had a group of friends I would often hike with, but since they all had jobs with unpredictable hours, it was hard to plan trips together. So I'd sometimes go on short hikes alone to enjoy some peace. This particular weekend, I had time off, so I found a good hiking and camping trail nearby and headed out on Saturday morning. I'd been on this trail once a couple of years back and had always wanted to return. The trail made a loop, basically a big circle, and took about a day and a half to complete. I parked in a small gravel lot, got my gear ready, and set off. The first few miles were pretty flat, mostly grassy fields before it led into a forest at the base of a small hill. By now, it was probably midday, and I had reached the forest when I saw someone ahead. He was too far for me to tell if he was walking towards or away from me, but as I got closer, I realized he was coming my way. This trail wasn't too popular, and the last time I hiked here, I didn't see anyone. But it was the weekend, so maybe he just had the same plan as I did. As he came nearer, I noticed he didn't have a backpack, which struck me as odd, considering I was about 6 or 7 hours into the trail, and it would be hard to go that far without any water. When he was a few feet away, he waved. I waved back, trying to be polite but also staying cautious because we were in such a remote area. As he passed me, I heard his steps stop, and when I turned, he was facing me. Then he asked me something odd. "Where's your group at?" I didn't know how to reply. All I could think about was if he somehow knew I usually hiked with friends or if he was trying to confirm I was alone. I responded by saying that my group was just a few minutes behind me. I didn't want him to think I was out there by myself. "Good," he replied with a smile before continuing on his way. I went on in the opposite direction, further down the trail. For the next few hours, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange interaction and how unsettling it felt. The fact that he didn't have a pack on, so deep into the hike, made it all the more disturbing. I decided I'd find a spot a little ways off the main trail to set up camp, just in case. I found a flat area about half a mile off the path and set up my tent. The sun was setting by then, so I sat outside for a bit, trying to relax and put the encounter out of my mind. I had packed a small meal, so I ate, then got into my tent to try to sleep. I lay there for probably over an hour, unable to rest, when I suddenly heard footsteps coming from behind my tent. I froze, listening to the sound of footsteps getting closer. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but they sounded too much like a person's steps. They were maybe 15 to 20 feet away when they stopped. I lay there for what felt like ages, heart pounding, but no more sounds came. I knew that whoever or whatever it was must still be nearby, since I didn't hear any footsteps fading away. Eventually, hours had passed, and as the first light of morning came, I knew I had to get out of there. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out, and saw nothing. I carefully packed up my gear, all the while looking around and jumping at every small noise. Just as I finished, I saw clear footprints in the dirt behind a tree right near my tent. Panic set in, and I didn't look for any more tracks. I just ran back to the trail. I was scared out of my mind, knowing someone had been watching me in the middle of a remote forest, far from help. Once I reached the trail, I started backtracking, deciding it was safer than continuing forward where the person might be waiting. Thankfully, the rest of the hike back to my car was uneventful, though I didn't reach the parking area until nearly sunset. I told my friends about the strange man and the sound of footsteps, and they all said I was lucky to have gotten out without incident. I reported the encounter to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. Now, I'm much more cautious when hiking or camping alone, and I usually go with my friends. I'll never know what that guy's intentions were, and I hope no one else ever finds out. I decided to spend a weekend camping in a spot that a friend had recommended. The place was about an hour's drive from town, tucked away deep in the woods. I wanted some time alone to clear my head, so I packed up my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight, then hit the road early Saturday morning. It was cool and overcast as I drove, perfect weather for spending time outdoors. I parked at the small, empty gravel lot at the trailhead and double-checked that I had everything I needed before setting off. The forest was peaceful, and as I hiked along, I noticed the quiet. There were hardly any birds or insects making noise. It struck me as odd, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to the season. After a couple of hours, I reached the small clearing where I'd set up camp. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, surrounded by tall trees that felt almost like walls closing in around me. I tried to enjoy the silence, but it was just a little too still for my comfort. As the afternoon wore on, I collected some wood and built a small fire to cook my dinner. The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I ate, staring into the flames and trying to shake the feeling that something was off. It was almost as if the forest was watching me. As darkness fell, the air grew colder. I huddled by the fire a while longer, but the uneasy feeling only grew. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing. Finally, I decided to turn in for the night and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight and settling into my sleeping bag. I must have dozed off for a while because the next thing I knew, I was awake, staring into pitch blackness. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me up, and then I heard it, faint rustling outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. It wasn't the sound of wind or an animal. It was something moving slowly, purposefully, just outside. I froze, every muscle tense, and hoped it would just pass by. Then I heard footsteps, careful and quiet, circling my tent. I lay there, motionless, my heart pounding. I could hear each step crunch softly on the fallen leaves. I dared not move, barely even breathed. The footsteps stopped directly by my head, and I held my breath, staring wide-eyed into the dark fabric of the tent. For what felt like hours, there was silence again. And then, slowly, I heard it again, the footsteps moving away from the tent, one step at a time, until they faded into the distance. I lay there, paralyzed, unsure if I was alone again, but I had no intention of staying to find out. I waited a few more minutes, straining to hear any other sounds, but there was nothing. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. I stepped out into the cold night air, scanning the dark trees around me. There was no sign of anyone, no shadow, no sound. The forest was still again. I quickly gathered my things, throwing them into my backpack as fast as I could. I could feel my pulse racing as I started back toward the trail, hardly daring to look behind me. The walk back felt endless, every shadow stretching and twisting in the corners of my vision. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. Finally, after what felt like hours, I made it back to the gravel lot and nearly ran to my car. I threw my backpack into the back seat, jumped in, and drove off, not looking back once. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I haven't been back to those woods since, and I never go camping alone anymore. I used to love the quiet, the peace of the forest, but now, that stillness just reminds me of that night, and it makes me shudder. Sometimes, even now, when I'm alone at night, I think I can still hear those footsteps, slow and steady, circling just out of sight.